Welcome to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a production of LibertyNation.com, hosted by Mark Angelides.
The legacy of slavery never appears to be far from the lips of the angry and the gleeful eyes of the media machine that revels in creating friction. It's an issue that is as divisive as it ever was, but it's also one of the few hot topics that is surrounded by so much myth and misleading information that one wonders if the waters on this are not muddled with intent. It seems strange that despite slavery in the US being ended around 1865 and in 1833 with the Abolition of Slavery Act in the UK, that slavery itself actually still exists today. How is this possible, you might ask? Have you ever met someone who traffics in human beings? Have you ever heard of a neighbor owning an actual person? And yet it does happen. To discover how this abhorrent practice continues today, and even thrives in some places, we need to ask the age-old question: who benefits? How many people alive in the United States today would support slavery? That's a key question that's never asked. There will undoubtedly be a small minority, almost negligible on a nationwide scale, but the overwhelming majority would respond with a resounding no. And so how is this still an issue that divides us? There are many on both sides of the political divide that believe that the legacy of slavery still exists, but not that actual slavery is still taking place right under their noses. Surely if the actors on either side wanted real resolution, a coming together, a cause that could unite, it should be the eradication of this great evil. But these self-same folks who engage in historical revisionism are just not willing to see the plain truth. Slavery is a big business. When we think of slavery, we often envisage black people in chains working in fields treated as something less than human. But that was in the old days. It's neither as open nor as blatant right now. There are many forms of contemporary slavery that are happening today, from sex workers being trafficked around the world to migrants being promised a better life in a new country only to be held without paperwork or with family under threat back home. Even nail salons, cannabis fields, domestic help, construction workers, factory workers, and not forgetting the young victims of forced marriages. So who's behind it all? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, but perhaps an easier one would be, who allows it to happen? The fact is that globalists bear a whole lot of responsibility for allowing this disgraceful trade to continue. A little outlandish, you may think. After all, big tech, giant retailers, major industrials have policy after policy that prevents slavery. But consider this. In the United Kingdom, it's a requirement that all major companies with a turnover in excess of £36 million publish an annual Modern Day Slavery Act statement. So clearly, the government is aware that global supply chains and companies have an effect on actual slavery. But how? And why does it continue if these wonderful megacorporations are printing the truth about their global suppliers? Let's first look at slavery outside Western nations, which is by far the larger proportion. In the fields of Asia and the mines of Africa, lives are squandered in the names of production at ever lower cost. And for the owners of these modern-day plantations, keen to do business with the squeaky clean American companies who virtual signal all day long, what better way for these folks looking to get a great deal with a major conglomerate than by cutting wages to virtually zero? Consider the plummeting costs of solar panels and wind turbines. Has the technology in mineral extraction really improved so much that suppliers in South America and Southern Asia can keep dropping the prices of raw materials? If you want a concrete example of how the cost of labor is truly the main variable, simply look at the ever-expanding textile industry and its unquenchable thirst for fast fashion. During the late 90s and early 2000s, China was the go-to place for textiles. The trade shows in Guangdong are still legendary in their scope. But in recent years, although China still controls much of the dyeing and the sales internationally, the production and processing of the raw materials has shifted to countries with lower labor costs, namely Vietnam. And if those particular textile producers are not complicit in the great evil, what about further back along the line? These factories need fuel and power too. So even the factory of the world is now outsourcing to places that can get people working for a few cents a day. This is the incentive for slavery. When we buy a new shirt or even bedding, perhaps we look for the fair trade stamp in order to soothe an uneasy conscience. But we're fooling ourselves if we think that that seal guarantees that the cheap goods are free from the tinge of slavery. Think again. And what about inside our own borders? The latest figures suggest that in the United States alone, there are about 400,000 actual slaves. That's according to the Global Slavery Index. Again, the globalists have a lot to answer for. Sex trafficking of women and children, many of whom are forced to become drug addicts and lead short, miserable, brutal lives before being disposed of. They're all but ignored when it comes to discussing slavery. The questions we should be asking is, how do these unfortunates get here? Because very few are native-born Americans. They're brought over the border by coyotes and sold to gangs or cartels with connections in South America, and then they just disappear. Who keeps the border porous? Who insists that we abolish ICE? Who spends billions of dollars to make puppet politicians oppose border security? Globalists. They want the cheap labor that comes with illegal immigration and are quite content that child slavery and rape is just an unfortunate side effect of their actions. In the UK, modern slaves are found working in car washes, being sent out as beggars or forced to work in criminal gangs. They're promised a new life in a rich country. They hand over their passports and find themselves sharing a house with 15 other men or women. Their wages forever withheld to pay for rent, spurious charges, clothes, uniforms, food, work, tools. And they're left with literally nothing. No passport, no recourse, no money, and the ever-present fear that they'll either be put in prison or that there'll be reprisals against their families back home. How could this happen in modern Britain? 3 words. The European Union. The EU guarantees 4 freedoms: free movement of goods, capital, services, and of course labour. Without border controls, people are trafficked from the poorer states to the richer, where they dream of a better future and end up a slave. And yet globalists and multinational corporations insist that borders remain open, free, unchecked. As often happens when folks talk of slavery, the question of value is brought up. How can a decent human being put a cash value on someone's very life? How can an historical slave owner see a living, breathing person and attach a dollar value? I think most of us agree that this is an almost inhuman attitude and action. So why are the globalists and multinational corporations doing just this? They're looking at their balance sheets and they're making decisions based on their bottom lines. They choose to work with outfits that pay the workers a pittance or less. They choose to advocate for open borders when even governments admit that this increases human slavery. They make these decisions, damn the consequences, and spend extra millions creating a public image of virtue and valor. Perhaps we need to talk about slavery more, not less, but change the focus. The past is gone. There's nothing we can do for those whose lives were squandered by bad people making inhuman decisions. Yet we can and must talk about the future and how to stop more people suffering the same ignoble fate. The globalists, the money-hungry behemoths that run every major corporation, have a lot to answer for they They're complicit in the perpetuation of slavery, the trafficking of children across virtually open borders. It's time to stop arguing about the past and begin dealing with the present.
Go deeper on the topic discussed in this video, head on over to one of these links here or go to our Liberty Nation Roku channel. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for Liberty.
The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a libertynation.com production.
Available at Libsyn, Apple iTunes, Stitcher, on Roku, and other fine podcast providers.